Hi, I'm Tim from timsteppingout.com, and today I wanted to talk about Peter, or Cephas. For the last, 6 months or so, I've sort of been resigned to assume that I'm never really going to figure out who Peter was. We can glean some information from Galatians and maybe some Petrine texts, but there are a lot of things about Peter that don't seem to be really cohesive, and he seems sort of generic. He just sort of seems like a prop. At least that's how I had viewed him anyway. I had kind of kicked around ideas that maybe he was the character on whom Peregrinus Proteus was based, which was a polemical text against somebody who Lucian had named Peregrinus. I'd also kicked around the idea that maybe Peter was Ignatius, who was a Syrian, or maybe Justin Martyr, who also seems to be connected in some ways to the Syrian community. But I had a person post a comment on an article I had written where I kicked around some ideas about whether or not the Apostle Paul existed. And this person who posted said, I think Peter was Cerinthus. That makes a lot of sense to me as I think about it. And as I sort of digested that idea a little bit, it just makes more and more sense as you look at it. It just fits beautifully, especially if you are willing to assume that some of these things that were being written about in the New Testament were kind of written in code, were sort of ciphers to sort of provide an abstract idea to a specific conflict that was going on, particularly in the letter to the Galatians. Irenaeus, in Against Heresies, when he's writing about the Ebionites, he contrasts them both to Cerinthus, who he said was pretty close to the Ebionites, except that he thought there was a fall from the Godhead. But both Cerinthus and the Ebionites thought that Jesus and the Christ were separate, and that the Christ descended on to Jesus. And all they say about Paul is that he's an apostate from the law. So in other words, they were adherent to the Jewish law. Where it really starts to make a lot of sense is when you bring in Marcion, because Marcion was contrasted to Cerinthus. You think of Marcion, he's Paul's earliest and most zealous consumer, and he is really probably upsetting the Ebionites and the Nazarenes, but he'd also be upsetting Cerinthus because he refuses to acknowledge that Jesus was flesh, that he thought that Jesus was just a phantom appearing like a man. But you can see that in a lot of ways Marcion is closer to Cerinthus than he is to the Ebionites. He's in fact almost an antithesis to the Ebionites, whereas Cerinthus and the Ebionites were just a little bit different. When you read Galatians, there's a really interesting part in there in Galatians 2 where Paul opposes Cephas to his face because Cephas had been corrupted by men from James, that he wouldn't eat with the uncircumcised anymore. If you kind of look more abstractly at what is going on in that exchange between Paul and Cephas, what Paul is saying is that he was mad at Cephas because he was adhering more to the Jewish side, to the men from James, and that the men from James had corrupted his faith. The specific detail that he wasn't eating with the uncircumcised anymore, I think that's just abstractly saying he's not hanging around with the Gentiles anymore, with the non-Jews. What's interesting is that when you look at the Gospel of Mark, it almost seems like Mark is making a reference to this exchange to Cephas when he says, Jesus says to Cephas, "Get behind me, Satan." That is a really, really important detail, I think. I don't think it's just a passing reference. I don't think that Jesus was saying that Satan had momentarily gone into Cephas. I think that it was a polemic against Cephas. What's even more interesting is that Mark, in the Gospel of Mark, he seems to allude to Paul. When in Mark 9:38 and 39, he's saying, John comes to Jesus and says, we told a guy to stop casting out demons in your name because we didn't think that was right. And Jesus said, don't stop him because anyone who isn't against us is with us. As I've said before, it seems to me that the Gospel of Mark is very much connected to Cerinthus, which sort of makes this intriguing. Irenaeus even said that the people who don't believe Christ suffered on the cross like Mark. They like the Gospel of Mark. And that was what Cerinthus believed. Because Cerinthus believed that the Christ had left Jesus. So when you look at the Gospel of Mark, and Jesus is saying, "My God, why have you left me?" That is a pretty obvious reference to this notion that the Christ comes and goes from human bodies when he wants. So what may have been going on is that even though the Gospel of Mark is connected to this Cerinthus community, what I think you're seeing from Cerinthus to Marcion is an evolution in this docetic thought. This notion, if you're going to inject a fall from the Godhead, it's because you think that this is an inferior realm. The material realm is inferior. And so Marcion is the final step. He's the logical endpoint of that evolution, at least in the docetic view. They went nuts with this in the Gnostic view because they invented a really, really crazy set of things going on in outer space. That's what I think is going on with the Gospel of Mark, is that it is a stepping stone between Cerinthus and Marcion, where it is docetic. It's evolving this view. It's got this sort of anti-apostolic undertone, because it's not just Cephas that the Gospel of Mark doesn't treat kindly. The Gospel of Mark doesn't treat any of the apostles kindly. They all are a bunch of jerks in it. Jesus tells them to give people bread, and they just stand around saying, "How are we going to afford that?" Obviously, the Gospel of Mark does not see the apostles as very important characters. You could read it and say, oh, they're just props, they're just literary devices. It could be that, or it could be that the Gospel of Mark was inheriting a tradition that was sort of rebelling against a status quo, so to speak, where you've got pillars in the community who don't seem to represent the people in the evolution of the philosophical thought within the theology. So that's all I really wanted to say today, just to kind of point out that, man, this Cerinthus-Peter connection does seem to really fit in a lot of ways. And so, I think that it might be kind of my running hypothesis going forward here, at least until I find something that disproves it. So anyway, thanks.